For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Did you know that the National Security Strategy issued by the United States last year identified climate change as one of the biggest national security threats? Did you know that the Indian Army, to accelerate decarbonization and to reduce dependence on fossil fuels, inked a contract with an arm of the NTPC to set up green hydrogen projects? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I am your host Anil Padmanabhan. Normally, countries risk conflicts due to an array of external actors. Either it could be a direct assault by a country, as we are seeing in the Russia-Ukraine war, or it could be simply state-sponsored terrorism. Living next to the terror factory of the world, we know this threat only too well. However, this risk matrix is now being reset by the rise or rapid surge of actorless threats. Worse, these actorless threats don't respect borders. Here, I'm talking about pandemics like COVID-19, food security risks, energy shortages, inflation, and of course, the downsides of climate change. In fact, several countries, including the United States, have raised climate change as a national security risk. To understand why and more, we spoke to Erin Sikorsky. She's the director of the Washington-based Center for Climate and Security. Erin is among the scholars who have consistently argued that climate change is a national security threat.
As the planet warms, there are multiple pathways through which it is affecting security concerns around the globe. Right? One is just the direct effects of climate hazards themselves, the floods, the sea level rise, the droughts. This can harm critical infrastructure for countries, right? Energy infrastructure. It can harm military infrastructure and readiness of militaries, right? When militaries are being deployed to respond to disasters around the globe, that may take away from other concerns they have elsewhere, right? Or the ability to prepare for other threats. But at the same time, another pathway is where these climate hazards exacerbate existing risks, right? They layer on top of other national security challenges. And I was just reading this morning about the drought in Tunisia, for example. They've put controls on water there. The government has limited the amount of water that can be used by the population. And this comes on top of, economic challenges the country has been facing, political challenges, and there's a real concern that this climate issue, the drought, could spark instability or potential internal conflict. And there it's not climate alone, but it's climate plus other things. It adds more stress. And then the third pathway I would highlight is that as countries are responding to climate change as well, right? As countries are looking to transition to clean energy, looking for access to critical minerals, for example, that are needed in solar panels or in batteries, it changes countries' national interests and can lead to potential conflict or challenges in places in new ways that haven't sprung up before. So there's a geopolitical element as well. So really, there's nothing in national security policy that isn't touched by climate change in some way. And so a climate lens is really important for all different issues in national security.
I was curious as to how this would stack up in a country's national security matrix, especially when compared to traditional external threats.
Yeah, I think it's up there, and I think it's, and it's a little different than just racking and stacking, like where does climate change, say, fall in comparison to terrorism or in comparison to conventional war as we see in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? But it's the nexus, right? And so it's a systemic risk in many ways. So you have climate change affecting terrorism, right? It potentially provides opportunities for terrorists when governments can't respond well to climate hazards, that you could see terrorists stepping in to say, we'll provide you the humanitarian aid, we'll provide you the water resources you may need. It allows them access to more recruits, perhaps. And similarly, as you know, here in the United States, as the government thinks about competition with China, it's not either China or climate change, but it's, again, how do the two intersect and how do we think about it? But I do certainly think that, in terms of resources for the national security community, for security actors, where should they be spending their time and focus? That climate change needs to move up there compared to in the past, where it was considered, that's a soft security issue, that's not a real hard security issue.
Logically, this will warrant recalibration of the national security and foreign policies of countries.
And what's really important in terms of foreign policy is a recognition that for many countries around the world, that climate is at the top of their list, right, of things they're concerned about. When you look at surveys of, I was just looking at one recently of ASEAN member nations, and citizens were asked to rank, what are you most worried about in terms of security risks? And climate is at the very top. So for countries that want to have a foreign policy of engagement and building allies and partners around the world, climate considerations need to be part of that conversation. And I think particularly climate finance and funding for adaptation and climate resilience programs is really important in this conversation between the global north and the global south, and the countries that have been responsible for emitting a lot of emissions over time to help countries that are actually the most vulnerable now to these changes, right? But haven't been responsible for the emissions. And I think that's important not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's a national security imperative, right? It's important to not have instability and risks of conflict due to these climate hazards in countries around the globe. And so an investment up front in climate finance and is really important. So I think foreign policies need to recognize that. I think foreign policies also need to recognize, as I said earlier, that there's new domains of competition opened by climate change. So again, access to critical minerals, access to fish stocks, for example. As fish move different parts of the ocean because of warming temperatures, because of overfishing, there's fewer fish available. There's going to be competition to access those resources, especially in places perhaps like the Arctic, as the ice melts there and there's more accessible ocean space for countries to move in. So thinking ahead, too, is going to be really important for countries.
It is then clear that a clean or a green economy is no longer just a desirable milestone. In fact, it is a very important line of defense for countries. However, this requires a mindset reset.
You're right. And I think, the war in Ukraine really, I think, kind of brought that home, especially to Europe, but also to the United States, that being dependent on fossil fuels and being dependent on one country like Russia that may have different security interests, right, than Europe is really a risk, and it's a security risk. And that the solution to that is not finding fossil fuels elsewhere, but building real resilience and energy resilience through investments in clean energy. And if you look at what's happened in the past year in the transition to clean energy across Europe, it's actually accelerated in part in response to this invasion, because there was a recognition that we need, that countries need their own energy sources that are not dependent on getting fossil fuels elsewhere. And so I think, like you said, yeah, it's a mindset shift, that this isn't just a nice to have if you're a tree hugger and an environmentalist, but this is really, even if you don't care about that stuff and you care about hard security, clean energy is the way to go. And you have those conversations with military actors too, that there's operational benefits, right? When you look at the casualties, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan of US and NATO soldiers, most of those casualties were along supply lines, right? Delivering water and fuel to the front. And so if you can change that equation, that you're not as dependent, that creates operational benefit.
This pivot is possible only if there's a convergence between domestic and foreign policy. They can no longer operate independent of each other.
So thinking through the nexus between domestic and foreign policy is really important. Also thinking through when we frame what is a national security threat and what should we be using our national security apparatus, right? All the tools we have in our national security community, how should we use those? I think there are opportunities to use some of those tools to help manage climate hazards. And the example I'll give you here is last year, Hurricane Ian in Florida, right? Devastating, huge hurricane. The National Geospatial Agency here in the US, which is an intelligence agency that does overhead imagery, they actually deployed some of their officers to Florida to help with search and rescue, which is an unprecedented, in my experience, use of that kind of tool for a domestic purpose for a natural disaster. But I think it's a good one. And I think it's one we should look for more and find opportunities. There's also opportunities around using overhead imagery to predict certain wildfire chances or to look at flooding, right, risks. And so I think, again, as you said, I love this phrase mindset shift that you use, like mindset shift about what is a national security threat? What's a homeland security threat? We went through a bit of that after 9/11 here in the US and terrorism. I think we need to do that again as we think about these actorless risks like climate, like COVID, right? And how do we use our resources smartly to manage these risks?
I asked Erin to share how the rest of the world was coping with this wave of actorless threats.
It's really interesting to see around the globe how different countries are approaching this. Obviously, throughout Europe, you've seen a lot with NATO, has done a lot of work on climate security. You've seen work in sub-Saharan Africa. I've looked at Kenya a little bit, where their military is doing quite a bit on ecological restoration in the country and addressing climate risks. South Africa, I was just reading, in the wake of their most recent floods, their chief of defense forces argued that they need a new branch of the military whose job is just to manage these risks. So it's certainly, we're seeing conversations in a lot of different places, a lot of multilateral forums. New Zealand is another one that for a long time has looked at humanitarian assistance and disaster response as their military's number one job. And so when they think about where they're, what resources they need to invest in. So this conversation, it's happening at the UN as well. There's a lot of discussion there about climate change and security. And you see in a lot of peacekeeping missions that climate is being inserted into the conversation. So it's really a conversation in lots of different parts of the globe for sure.
It isn't clear that the risks from climate change are rapidly escalating. They are reaching the point of no return. Together with economic contagion and pandemics, they are rewriting the security landscape for the world. Addressing these actorless threats is not going to be easy, especially in a world witnessing deteriorating geopolitics. But as they say, the clock is ticking. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Strat News Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.